So our organisations, Stonewall Scotland, Equality Network, Scottish Trans Alliance and LGBT Youth Scotland have been working collaboratively to engage with the Parliament on this petition since it was first considered by the Public Petitions Committee.
It is often seen as a form of torture. And the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims said that conversion therapy violates the global ban on torture. The United Nations Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity say that some cases, depending on their severity and the form, can amount to torture. So on that basis, we would say that people cannot consent to be abused. People cannot consent to torture. It is not possible to change your sexuality or your gender identity. It cannot work. Anything that does come out of that process is based on trauma. It is based on suppression. It's based on denial of fundamental, unchangeable aspects of who someone is, their sexuality and their gender. So just from the outset, we'd say that we consider conversion therapy to be a form of torture, and it does not work. It cannot work. You cannot change your sexuality or gender. In the cases where people may consent to it, again, with that said, that people cannot consent to torture.
The same kinds of coercion, torture that you've both been talking about, and
risk of torture.
And individuals torture or other
torture victims.
To counter this form of torture.
So torture, I would just ask that first and foremost you consider survivors when drafting any legislation and not to allow these loopholes to be opened up. There is a point of just absolute principle here that conversion therapy is wrong in all of the form it takes, and that includes sexuality, that includes gender, that includes places of religion, if it takes place in religion. It's a form of torture. Torture should be outlawed outright in all instances.
I think when you said you can't consent to torture, I think that was really strong, possibly.
The Scottish Government seemed to indicate that in terms of being able to end conversion therapy, it looks like there may need to be some form of legislation brought forward to fill the gaps that aren't covered by existing platforms of legislation.
Obviously, there's lots of laws already exist outlining torture, rape and any forms of abuse. And I was wondering, could you help me, what benefit would a new law have in regard to effective enforcement?
I think the difficulty around conversion therapy in the UK, and again, I distinguish this from many of our clients who have experienced more harmful forms of conversion therapy abroad, but forms that are already clearly illegal. So rape, for example, as an instrument of conversion therapy. And I just want to raise that, to indicate to you for a moment what the far end of conversion therapy looks like, but also what are the damaging beliefs that underlie it that we're seeking to stem. In taking leadership around the idea that it is not legitimate to try to engage with someone to change their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So the difficulty here in the UK is, as you've just pointed out, an action like rape or physical assault is already illegal. But there is other behaviour, harmful behaviour, which is not being captured and prosecuted because it's not being picked up in the frameworks we have.
Just to maybe push a wee bit on that then, is it more of a package you're looking for of education around the Crown Office, around the Procurator Fiscal, around the police, around civic society generally about this, rather than... I still haven't quite worked out what a change of law criminally, now I appreciate it's to think civil, but criminally, what would the difference criminally be in regard to this? And is it more to do with how we educate society, police, Crown, rather than necessarily a change in the law?
No, I think it is important to support a ban that includes criminalisation of the offence, and the reason for that is because the gap there's a gap there where the harm that occurs. So that's engaging with someone, as I said, very often speaking.
Not all torture is physical.
Speaking or taking advantage of a position of power, basically, in order to try to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, that is very difficult to pursue, and also is not possible to pursue in all contexts. So that is the gap. Indicates kind of, again, the severity and the importance, our recognition that there is a harm, that we have an obligation to stop a harm from being perpetrated. That is typically the sort of practice that you would be looking to address with a criminal sanction rather than just a civil penalty. And I would say that, you know, states have a choice of looking at civil or criminal penalties. But criminalisation of a particular practice indicates kind of, again, the severity and the importance, our recognition that there is a harm, that we have an obligation to stop a harm from being perpetrated. That is typically the sort of practice that you would be looking to address with a criminal sanction rather than just a civil penalty.
And personally, my personal view is I don't think religious leaders should be touching this area of sexuality and gender identity at all. I think this is a matter for professionals. It is, you know, we often think that prayer seems very soft, very, you know, harmless, but actually in this particular area of it's like any other quite sensitive area. It needs a professional who's fully trained.
Know that, you know, even prayer, I think there's this idea that prayer is kind of lesser than electroshock therapy or whatever. But we know, and we certainly know through reading the evidence, that prayer is harmful.